Welcome to today's presentation. My name is Hannah Sherratt and I am going to introduce today's webinar, and I will also be monitoring the chat. We host these events to hopefully give you some information that you find useful, and we do appreciate any feedback you have to help us continuously improve the presentations that we deliver. So in a moment, I will be posting a link to a survey for you to provide feedback on the presentation, both on how useful that presentation is and also the pace that we run through it and the level of detail, so that we can make sure in future we kind of pitch it correctly. So in a moment, I'll be handing over to Brian Hoy to deliver the presentation on Ofgem's Access Significant Code Review. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Hannah. What I'm just going to run through today is really a bit of an update. So there's kind of quite a few slides, so I'm going to go through at, I suppose, a fair bit of notes, really. There's a bit in case people weren't aware of the kind of the first consultation they did on this last year, but mainly trying to focus on the changes in the recent consultation that Ofgem launched at the end of January. So that'll be most of the focus. So after each kind of bit, I'll probably just pause and we'll just see if there's any questions in the chat. We'll try and pick those up, and hopefully, if I manage to get through at pace, we'll have a bit of time for any final questions at the end. So I thought, just by way of context, it was worth just talking a little bit about what an SCR is. And say a lot of these slides have got a lot of detail on them. I'm not going to cover them all. We're going to make the slides available as we normally do, so that there's a bit more reference for people if we wish to read them later. But basically, a significant code review is a mechanism Ofgem has to take a kind of holistic view and review changes to codes that actually form a lot of our industry practice, really. And the particular one that we'll talk about today has been known as the Access Significant Code Review, and that's looking at access arrangement and forward-looking charges. And I'll explain a little bit in a minute as to how that's changed, and actually it's been effectively split in two, but I'll update that a little bit. The main bit for most people will be the kind of connections boundary bit, and probably spend most time on that. But there's some of the access rights that they're consulting on as well that will have some relevance for a lot of you as well. So just, I suppose, a bit of a sort of noddy guide to, and this probably covers the two broad parts of the SCR work that Ofgem are doing. So there's a bit on the left looking at connection charges. So those are obviously paid for by the connecting customer. They're one-off charge, and they cover the extension assets and some contribution to reinforcement as well. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And then the other side of the coin, in terms of the other source of money we get as a DNO, is the use system charges, and that's actually covered in the forward-looking charges bit, as you'll see in a minute. So some of that's been time shifted in the process. So in terms of how we've got here, this process started back in December 2018 when Ofgem issued out their launch of this piece of work. So it's been going on over a number of years, and the approach that they've taken really is to I suppose hone down options, really. So they started looking at a long list of possibilities that they could look at. Then that got limited down to a short list, and that was done in March 2020. And then in spring, was actually in June last year, they actually issued its minded to consultation on three bits of that, on the distribution network charges, which is really we'll refer to as a connection boundary, a bit about access rights, and a bit about transmission charges. And most of the rest of the presentation will cover where those things have moved to since then. So there's a link on there if you want to actually go back to the original consultation in June. They had a lot of responses. They had 153 responses, which, if I'm honest, I think is the highest number of responses to an Ofgem consultation I've ever been aware of. So that's fed into and influenced some of the thinking that Ofgem has done since that consultation was launched. So the more recent updates, as I alluded to before, there are probably two bits of this. First of all, Ofgem intend to split the original scope of the work they did into two bits. A phase one, which will focus on the connection boundary and access rights, which is really what we're going to focus on today, as I said. And the plan is that they're going to complete that probably March this year with a final decision, with an implementation date of April 2023. So they're separating that bit out to actually progress that and get that finished more quickly. The other part that they're going to split into phase two is the review of dual charges. So just how everybody pays for their electricity on an ongoing basis. That's going to have a later implementation date. I think they talked about 2025 at the earliest, and really they've paused some of that work in the last probably 6 to 9 months because of some other work that they've been doing, but they're going to kind of kick that off again in probably about April to start that work. But again, that's not going to kick into, I think, 2025 at the earliest. So that's another bit of work that they've consulted on, and again, the final decision that is imminent, but I think that's a very much a clear direction of travel for them. The second bit, which is the point of today, really, is Ofgem have updated their Minded 2 position since the June position that they published last year. That I think takes account of a lot of feedback they've had from stakeholders, and as I say today, is mainly focusing on that, and in part, drawing your attention to it because that's a live consultation. It runs to 21st of February, so it's got a few weeks left. There's a link on there. So if any of the stuff I'm talking about today is of interest, then please go and have a look at the full document. Today is just to really whet your appetite and give you a bit of an executive summary of what's in there. If some of those things are relevant for you and your business, then take the opportunity to read the full document and respond to Ofgem. So I'm going to start on I'll just pause with any questions just on the kind of process bit before I jump in. No, that's fine. Okay, so we'll start with the connections boundary, which is probably the most significant bit for probably most people on the call, really. So I suppose just a bit of terminology as to what, when I'm talking about connection boundary, what do I mean? When we're connecting people currently, there are kind of what we're called deep connection charges, shallowest connection charges, and shallow. So deep connection charges, which we don't really have in Great Britain now, but we used to have, basically means that the customer connecting pays for everything. It pays for the new connection assets, it pays for reinforcement at the voltage at the same level as the one above, and it pays for all reinforcement basically all the way through. In transmission, they have a shallow connection charge where basically then you just in your connection charges pay for the new connection assets here. And distribution then has got a bit of a halfway house, what's called the shallowest connection charge. That's actually where you, as many of you will know, pay for a proportion of that reinforcement at the voltage level above your connection point and the one above. And I suppose that the point of this is just to explain that this piece of work by Ofgem in terms of the connection boundary is really just looking at the reinforcement. So there's no proposals to change connection assets, else they'll be fully funded by the customer. This piece of work is purely looking at the associated reinforcement. So this slide, I'll not go through all of this in detail. This was really just in their original consultation as to why they'd initiated this piece of work, and I suppose there were two primary concerns really. One, a distortion between distribution and transmission, as I said before. Transmission has a shallow connection boundary, and distribution's got a shallowish connection boundary. and therefore they were concerned that actually those differences might create some distortions in terms of where customers were wishing to connect between distribution and transmission. And then the second reason was about they were concerned that actually the costs of paying for the reinforcement could act as a barrier to entry for some users and slow down the uptake of low carbon technology. So that was it. That was their two. That's what they stated were their two concerns for initiating this review. And as you'll see in a minute, some of those are acting as trade-offs and has refined their thinking, because there are tensions between who pays for what. So this is a kind of a summary of what Ofgem said in June, and in a minute I'll update you in each of these. But just in kind of summary for context, if people weren't familiar with what was published last year, they were proposing a shallow connection boundary for demand, and I've got some examples just to illustrate this quickly. Basically means for demand connections, and the June position was the DNO would fund all the reinforcement and recover that through dual charges to all customers that are connected. For generation, slightly different, that they were going to retain a shallowest connection boundary, but shallower than current. So in practice, that was proposing that generation connections would only pay for reinforcement at the same voltage level as a POC, but they wouldn't pay for the one above. But they were planning to retain the high cost cap as applies today. So again, some change for generation, but not as extreme. And then they also confirmed that transmission works. I just saw that question come. No, these slides are now all talking about distribution. So the proposed changes are only changes at distribution. Point 3 was about where there were charges that were on the transmission network that were being passed down to the DNO. Then the proposal was to retain that, and they would be fully funded by the connecting customer that was connected to the distribution network. So effectively no change to the existing arrangements. And then the last bit of the work that they did, they had looked at having deferred payments or introducing liabilities and securities as happens in grid, but they proposed not actually introducing those. So that was where they got to in June. So if I just suppose try and illustrate that in a couple of ways, just so people get their heads around the changes. So on the left here is the current approach, and then this was their kind of minded to. So as I said before, extension assets, no change, they're fully funded by the customer. And as I just said, on the transmission, charges coming through to distribution connected customers, again, that would be fully funded, pass through. The changes are more in this bit here where the reinforcement happens at the different voltage levels. So where the voltage for the reinforcements at the same voltage level as a POC, as I said before, you can see here it's a bit easier maybe to see visually. In demand, that wouldn't get charged, but it would remain chargeable and done on a cost apportioned basis for DG. But for the reinforcement 1 voltage level above, then that wouldn't be chargeable. There are some exceptions to that I'm going to come on to in a minute, as you'll see when we go through the updated. But that was their kind of minded to. And then that just shows that the kind of the different split. So you can see the amount of green where there's a degree of socialization and that being split between the connecting customer and GEOS goes to a much smaller amount in the future. And then a little sort of very simplistic diagram to show what connecting customer would pay for. So they would currently pay for the extension assets. You would pay for any reinforcement at the same voltage level, and you would pay, again, cost apportioned for the 33 connection here. In the future, then actually for demand, all that you pay for is that for the extension assets, and the reinforcement would be funded by GEOS customers, again with some exceptions that I'll talk about in a minute. And then again, just the same sort of picture for generation. So you currently pay for the extension assets, you pay for any reinforcement at both 11 kV and 33, but in the future, then some of that drops off. So you wouldn't pay for the 33 reinforcement in this case, but you would still pay for your extension assets and any reinforcement at 11 kV. Okay, so that was where they got to in June. And then if I just quickly go through then some of the updates and the changes, because these are the kind of most important bit. So I suppose probably the most significant change in terms of the things they're proposing relates to the high cost cap. So for DG they intend to keep that. The idea is that they will actually keep it as is now. So this is a kind of change to what they had in their mind to do, in that it'll include the reinforcement at the same voltage level as the POC plus the one above in calculating the high cost cap. So that's a slight change from the June 21 position. The more significant change is for demand, where Ofgem intends to introduce a similar approach. So if you look at the graph on the right here, this sort of shows the kind of trend of reinforcement on a pounds per kVA basis. So you can see, if you look roughly at that sort of line of £1,000, you can see the vast majority of the projects are all under that line. So it's kind of fairly flat, but there is a sharp spike up here at the end for a small number of projects where the pounds per kVA is significantly higher. So Ofgem's thinking is to protect US customers from these excessive costs. They'd apply a high cost cap that triggers probably in around about here, and that's one of the things they're asking views on. The suggested, based on the data DNOs provided, is that if you look at the 95th percentile, so that's saying this would only affect 5% of the connection offers issued. Then if you look at that, it's round about £1,400 per kVA. So it's that sort of magnitude. So the idea is it doesn't affect the vast majority of connection applications, but some that are expensive on a pounds per kVA basis would be caught by this, and then the customer would pay for reinforcement costs above that threshold. It is on a pounds per kVA basis, so it isn't quite as intuitive as it just pure money. So expensive ones aren't always caught by the cap because it depends on the capacity that's triggered. But if it's small capacity requiring a lot of reinforcement, then those are the ones that it's trying to pick up. So as I say, that's one of the things Ofgem are asking for comments on. So I can see lots of questions coming in there, but I'll go through the next few slides and then we'll pause and actually pick up some of those questions in a sec. So there's a few other clarifications. Some of these I don't think were maybe as significant, but it's worth being aware on, and there were things that they just sort of clarified in their thinking, which has been helpful. So in-flight projects, so any project at any stage effectively will keep the charging regime in terms of which it was quoted. So that means there'd be no sort of automatic cancellation and reapplying. Customers can cancel the project and reapply, and then they will just get a new queue position for that application. But that's what they'll need to balance off, because if there are costs incurred on that project, then they may not get any money back that they've expensed. Not every project will benefit from the new rules. It's probably 50-20% of projects only have reinforcement. So for lots of projects, this change will not have any effect. So there'll be no benefit in that. But there may be some where customers will choose to cancel, but people need to do that at their own kind of commercial risk, and that's what Ofgem have effectively clarified. The second point was just they've clarified that there'll be no rebates for anybody who's previously paid for reinforcement. That was something people had asked as part of the consultation, but they've confirmed that that's not their intention to give any any money back for anybody who previously has paid for reinforcement. The third point then is about non-firm connections. So across GB, there are a number of people who've connected on what are generally known as flexible connections, where they've made that commercial choice to connect with the risk of curtailment, and they've saved the reinforcement cost currently. Ofgem's confirmed that yes, people can apply for a firm connection, and that will just be like a new application, and that will go through, and then the new rules would apply. And then the last point is clearly something that was of great interest for the DNOs. One of the concerns on this approach, because there's a sharp edge implementation date of applications received after the 1st of April, the concern was that we'll see a surge in applications after that date. And because that was caused by Ofgem, we'd raised the issue just that obviously we'd feel slightly aggrieved if we end up breaching a licence as a result of a change that Ofgem's instigated. So they're considering some mitigations just on how they deal with our licence obligations in that particularly that period following the April 2023 implementation date. So again, that's something they're consulting on. And then I think the last few of these for connections, they've confirmed their intention is to treat storage as generation for the purpose of connection charging. In the original consultation, they suggested treating it as generation if it was exporting, and treating it as demand as if it was importing. But they've proposing just to standardise that and always treat it as generation. And then I think the last two in this section are three-phase connections. So this is something that exists currently. It's doesn't apply to all three-phase connections. It's basically covering where the customer applies specifically for three-phase because they bought a hobby welder or hobby lathe or something like that that's three-phase, and the load that they would normally need, that they would normally have, doesn't actually, the load they've requested doesn't need three-phase. So they've not asked for 70 or 80 kVA. If they've only asked for 10 kVA, say, then rather than that being funded by all GEOS customers, then the proposal is to keep the existing regime where the customer would pay for that reinforcement. So the same principle applies for voltage level. If somebody's asked for a different voltage level than would be the norm for that size of capacity, then that can result in those charges. So today it hasn't happened that often, I don't think, but it's there to protect GEOS customers in terms of those excessive situations. And then the last one on the slide is speculative connections. So the proposal is no change to the existing approach, where as currently speculative connections would pay the full cost of reinforcement plus any ongoing operations and maintenance. I think it's one where there's probably going to be a little bit of work just reviewing the actual definition on it. But again, it's to protect GEOS customers from DNOs having to do excessive level of reinforcement if somebody is hugely speculative in their capacity that they're asking for. And I think that was my last slide. No, I've got a couple more I forgot about. So I think this is definitely the last slide in connections. So minimum scheme principles of lowest capital cost, Ofgem's confirmed that they intend to keep that as well. The same approach for the point of connection. So this was again just a level of detail in terms of how you consider particularly the substation that you might be connecting into, and they've confirmed that apply the same principle as now. So the breakers, if it was a primary, 33 to 11 kV primary, the HV breakers are considered to be at the lower voltage, but the transformers is considered to be at the higher voltage. So if somebody's connecting at 11 kV, and you had to change the breakers and transformer in the primary, they would contribute towards the breakers, but not the transformer itself. And then the electricity connection charging regulations, what are generally known as the second comer rules. So there's no change intended for the extension assets, so they would still remain. So if somebody's paid for it, extension assets and somebody else comes along and benefits from those, then we would charge the second comer and reimburse the first. So there's no change intended to that. The bit where Ofgem and BEIS are looking to make some amendments are around the reinforcement. So this is basically so that a customer connecting an ED2 won't get charged, because if they were a new customer, they wouldn't get charged for the reinforcement. Then the same principle would apply, where currently the way the regulations are written, we would be having to charge that customer, and they want to just equalise that, so customers get the same treatment, whether the reinforcement was kind of new reinforcement in ED2 or previous reinforcement in ED1 or earlier. And that really was the last slide on connections. So I'll pause there and just have a quick look at the chat to see if we can just throw some of these questions down. So I think covered David, point 3. I can't remember now which slide that was. Let me just flip back, I think. Yeah, I think that was here on this slide, I think, that Charles made that point. So yeah, yeah, I mean, they've not, it's not been something that's been picked up in the discussions with Ofgem. So in their mind too, I guess if they've not had much response or pushback on that, then they'll have done nothing more about it. So so again, you know, there's an opportunity to make your views known to Ofgem through the consultation process. Helen, on the treatment of transmission program distribution management. There is actually there's actually a Jacuza mod actually looking at that, Helen. I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but there is actually a proposal going through that somebody's raised, and there's a Jacuza group set up on that already. I'll find you the number and let you know. So it is so it is a live bit of work at an industry working group level. So Charles, don't know, Charles. I'd have to probably work through that scenario. But I think if the later application was demand, then I think probably yes. But you know, that's part of these examples that we're trying to flush out, and we're doing some work with the other DNOs, trying to think of all the kind of test cases and example to get clarity from Ofgem. So that's a useful one that we can put in the mix to actually consider and walk through with Ofgem to try and make sure what their intention is actually factored into the final decisions, and how that gets written into the charging methodology. Does this mean it generates traders? Does this mean it? So yes, so that's the intention of the high cost cap, is that for DG it would be effectively as now. So any reinforcement at the same voltage level or the one above would be considered in the high cost cap, and if it's above that threshold, then the customer would pay the incremental over the cost. So if BESS is like storage, then the Ofgem proposal is it'll be treated as generation in terms of charging. So that's what they've got in the consultation. So that's a bit where if that brings problems or issues to you, then please have a look at the consultation, read the full extent of the Ofgem justification, and provide them evidence and justification of that if you don't think that's appropriate. So is any consideration been given to second comer charge on both bills? So I think that the proposal for there's still a bit of work we're going through with Ofgem and Bayes, work out the detail of it, but in principle, the second comer charge, if it was extension assets, there'd be no change, that those would still continue. Currently, we would charge where we've done some reinforcement, and the bit that hasn't been recovered from the connected customer, then we would charge subsequent comers for that. That's a bit in the proposed change of the ECCR that would largely fall away to mirror the existing arrangement. So if it was for DG at the voltage level above, then the intention would be that customers wouldn't be exposed to that charge in ED2. So they're trying to just keep that consistent. So John, when Ofgem due to announce their final decision, the end of March, how they describe it now is it'll be the earliest will be the end of March. There's a lot of code mods to do as a result of this, so we've been pressing Ofgem that they can't really slip much beyond the end of March, because it only gives us a year to try and get all the code changes, and that's got to go through working groups and consultation. That takes a lot of time. So it's going to be end of March, possibly early April is the latest intelligence. Helen, it feels like demand high cost cutting in the Ofgem. So I think it's a good point, Helen. I suppose they haven't looked at any specifics. I think they're balancing in principle the two kind of sides of the equation. Is how do they ease charges for connecting customers, but on the other hand, doing that's not going to massively put up the charges to GEOS customers. And as you can see from that graph, if I can find it again. So if you look back to that graph, you can see the vast majority of connection cost for reinforcement is kind of fairly flat. So the only bit that they're going to actually want to kind of influence and have some sort of location signal is this sort of very exponential growth at the end. So there might be some car dealerships that will affect, but I don't know until you'd actually work out those. It's not meant to be target any particular type of customer. It's just trying to say, well, if there are ones where the reinforcement costs when you divide it by the capacity is if you think that's like 8 times the kind of average there, then those are the ones where they think that's maybe excessive for GEOS customers to pick up the tab. Yeah, you might have that view, Charles. I think there's a problem just in the way the legislation's written. So you might be right in principle, but there are some practical difficulties with it because it needs ECCR is triggered by a connection on the distribution network, and therefore that might not actually be able to apply. Alan, understanding will provide you. So it's basically if the capacity that somebody requests needs it to be 3-phase, then that's fine. There'd be 3-phase connection, and any reinforcement it'd be funded by the DNO. It's a similar principle to this high cost cap that is just trying to, I suppose, put that protection in. If somebody just says, I want 3-phase, and particularly, it's catering for rural situations where it might be a single phase network, and a more efficient solution might be for them to buy different equipment or to buy some sort of converter, then that might be a better solution, and it's just to protect those extremes. Should high cost capital and value? Yeah, that's one of the things Ofgem's looking at as to whether they change the value of the high cost cap for DG. Part of their latest thinking is that actually these high cost caps will probably get reviewed as part of the JUICE reform, so they might only last for a couple of years. So that might influence the decision whether to change the value offer, but it is something they're thinking about. Yeah, I'll find out and put it in the chat when I get a sec. Our V2G demand. I think there's, again, that's probably a good point on the EVs. I think generally I think there is some definition already of how those are treated, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. So I'll have a look into that. But that's a good point to actually that will need clarification. So yeah, no, that's very helpful. Right, I'm just conscious of time, so I want to just crack on and cover a little bit on access rights. So this is what Ofgem said in June, and they had some bits that they sort of paused then, and some bits that they progressed on. So what they were talking about, I think I've got the slides, probably better to actually explain what they're talking about and how they're thinking it could be used, really. So when they talk about access rights, it's talking about how you define the access to the network. So what level of import-export, when you can import-export, how long for, and whether it can be interruptible or not. Where they've got to now really is actually saying that actually, because in most cases customers will be paying for any reinforcement. So whilst, as I said before, we DNOs generally offer flexible connections where customers can choose to be curtailed, and they avoid then the cost of the reinforcement. So that's a kind of fairly standard product across DNOs currently. But with the connection boundary changes where people will be paying for the reinforcement, Ofgem recognises then that for most instances, apart from where the high cost cap plays in, is not going to be really something that people are going to wish for. Because why would you want to be curtailed if you can have a firm connection and not pay for the reinforcement? Where it's seen that these can be very useful, though, it is actually to be an interim solution where some reinforcement work is needed, but that might take, say 3 years to complete that work. Then having some sort of connection where it's kind of effectively non-firm and you could be curtailed might be an attractive proposition for some customers that allows them an earlier connection than having to wait till the reinforcement's done. It might not be suitable for everybody, but for some it may well be. As I said, for where there's high cost cap involved and you could be avoiding some costs, then it might be an enduring solution. But for a lot of customers, then it's more likely to be an interim solution just until that reinforcement is completed. So the idea is then to kind of effectively define the time that users are willing to be curtailed, and Ofgem are proposing some protection if the level of curtailment exceeds the kind of the forecast level, then there would be some financial compensation effectively as proposed. But some of that might need additional monitoring and control equipment in as well, so that will be part of that equation for customers to decide whether it's attractive or not. So the bits that they've clarified in the January update is partly on the definition of curtailment. So they've defined that as the actions by the DNO to restrict the conditions of a connection. But I suppose importantly, and this is a bit for people to kind of understand in their consideration of it, is it excludes customer interruptions, and because they're covered by guaranteed standards already, then it doesn't cover you if you go off. And similarly, if you're interrupted because of transmission constraints, then that will be excluded from the kind of the arrangements as well. In terms of how they should be calculated, that's not been defined yet, but often we're proposing that should be done consistently across the DNOs. So that's a piece of work that's still trying to progress to actually work out how that could be done, and I think there's still a bit of work to do in that, if I'm honest. And then, as I said, often we're proposing some protection for customers if they get curtailed over and above the forecast threshold, and their proposal is that DNOs will need to procure that service to act as an offset for the constraint from the market, which could be from the general market or could be from that customer. And an important bit that they're proposed is no caps or backstops proposed. So that's, whilst it might sound attractive, then I would say that is a thing to consider carefully in terms of, you know, how that will work in practice, and, you know, what way that drives the kind of behaviour and the commerciality of it. So, you know, no caps on the amount you get if you go over the threshold. Like I say, it might seem on first sight to be an attractive proposition, but if there's no limits on that whatsoever, then it might actually in the round not be the best thing. So I think it is one bit that is worth looking at and considering carefully. You know, I mean, certainly being uncapped has got risk from a DNO point of view, but I think it's worth thinking through, even from a customer point of view, whether having some boundaries within that is actually makes it a more balanced and workable proposition overall. So that'll be one that I think is worth a careful read. Then they've also consulting on the duration of the non-firm arrangements. So this is the time frame where you're kind of non-firm until the reinforcement's done. They're proposing explicit end dates for those, so those are clear to both parties. But one of the questions that posed is the timing of that, whether it's done just taking account of the kind of known or likely works and applications that are in, or whether actually it would be better overall for the development of the network if that is a little bit longer, so it gives time for more consideration of future development and more applications that might come in the future, so that actually a better solution that might be more strategic or holistic solution is actually put in place. So that's one of the questions that they've asked. And then time profile access, which was something that were proposed to take forward in the June position. They've decided they're not going to do any more work on that. It can still be used if need be, but they're not going to try and make that completely common at this stage. And time profile access is used occasionally by DNOs. A simple example probably an OWPD have used it in the southwest, where they've got loads of solar, and they've allowed wind to connect as long as they're not exporting effectively during the day in summertime. So, you know, they can export to the heart's content of winter and at night, but during the kind of summer daylight hours, then they're restricted. Okay, that's my quick run through. I'll just have a quick look at the questions. I didn't see any pop-ups. No more have come in. Okay, that's fine. I'll crack on and do my last little bit, and then we can pause if there are any more questions. So the last bit was on generous charging for small DG. So in their June position, basically they were proposing to charge generous charges to all generators above a megawatt, where they thought that those generators were all contributing to the use of the transmission network and therefore should pick up the cost. I think this was one area of the consultation where they probably got most clear feedback and less supportive. So it's one where their January update is that they've actually delayed their decision on implementing that. They're going to do some more work on where they're looking at the JUS reforms, and they're also looking at some of the TNUS reforms as well. So they've decided to park that bit, because I know that was certainly for DG customers potentially going to be a unattractive proposition, really, where they would suddenly get some more costs. So Ofgem have decided to suspend that decision for now and wrap it up with their wider transmission charging review that's been happening in parallel, and they had consulted on that last year, looking at a sort of call for evidence of that, where they're now, I think, sifting through the responses to that they got at the back end of last year. Right, I will pause for a quick drink of water and open up if anybody else has got any more questions. Whew. Stunned silence.
If you'd like to ask a question, raise your hands as well.
Charles, what is your feeling? Do you think that they will look to bring TNUS back round to DG again? Probably yes and no. I mean, if I probably sort of pressing what our response was, we didn't support Ofgem's proposal in June. We thought it was a bit half baked, if I'm honest. We've got some GSPs where we're exporting, then actually all the generation there is probably actually contributing to the use of the transmission network, and maybe for those charge would be appropriate. But we've got lots of situations where generation is connected to importing GSPs, and therefore it's just effectively, from Grid's point of view, suppressing the use of the transmission network. So to have a broad brush approach that every DG connection over a megawatt got charged just seemed to be a bit too blunt an instrument, really. But it's hard to argue where you've got an exporting GSP and they're actually exporting back into the transmission network that they aren't using the network. So I'd say charge is probably unavoidable, that there won't be some costs, but they might do it in a more maybe slightly more considered way that's actually a bit more cost reflective. So that would be my kind of view and expectation, that there will be something, but it might take a different shape and form to what they consulted last year.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, I've had the same feeling actually as you said. So yeah, that's good. We'll see what they come out with.
Yeah. Anything else from anybody else? Oh, there we go. Our timescales for reinforcement works to be completed like to increase as workload increases. I don't know. I mean, I suppose that's going to be the, if I'm honest, the challenge for all the DNOs at the minute is this is a kind of a major change in terms of the way connections are charged for. We don't quite yet know how that's going to materialise and what impact it's going to have on on you guys in terms of applying and speed of application and where people are going to apply. A peak of workload will invariably have some sort of pressure on that, but we're all under all sorts of incentives from Ofgem to not delay and not be a block to people getting connected. So there will be opposing pressures for us to be organised on that. There's a lot of pressure from Ofgem for us to use what they'll call sort of flexible services. So if we can contract with people to either reduce their demand or generate at sort of the right time, then, and we can avoid the reinforcement, then that's generally a cheaper solution than physical reinforcement. So all of those things will be in the mix. It's going to be hard because it's going to be different, and it'll take a bit of time for us all to actually kind of understand the new rules, work out what the consequences are. So hard to say. I say there's definitely a risk of that as workload increases, just because you get a scarcity resource. If everybody needs grid transformers and the production hasn't increased in those, that creates a delay in materials, can be the thing that can have the biggest effect, really. So it'll be a challenge, but I'd say we'll be there trying to minimize the disruption, and particularly these sort of non-firm access rights might allow people to connect with maybe with some curtailment risk granted, but be able to connect earlier, and therefore for some customers that'll be a very attractive proposition, I think. Okay, any more questions before we? Looks like we'll be able to close on time, which is good. Okay, well, hopefully that people find that useful. As I said, it was largely to give you a quick oversight of the Ofgem consultation. It's I think about 70 pages, but quite a lot of it is playing back the feedback they received to their consultation last year. If some of those things do affect you, or you're worried about them, this is just trying to draw attention to the consultation to allow you to put your views into Ofgem and be heard, and make a lot of the points that you've raised on the call today. I hope you find it useful. Hannah sent a link just to try and assist the feedback, because we always like to know what's gone well, what we can improve on to try and improve these events for you. We'll probably end up doing another one, I'll say April-ish, depending on when Ofgem make a decision, and we'll probably do a similar one when we've got the final decision from Ofgem. But we thought there were some significant changes in this, that it was worth doing an interim one, just to hopefully be a short, sort of bite-sized, digestible download of what's in the document. And if it whets your appetite, then encourage you to go and have a proper read and respond before the 21st. No problem. Thank you. You're on mute, Hannah.
Thank you. I just wanted to wish everyone a lovely afternoon. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I do hope it has been useful. We have recorded the webinar, so we should be publishing that shortly, and I expect we will be sending the slides out as well. If you do have any comments, please get in touch at ice@enwl.co.uk. Let us know if you've got any comments or questions. Thank you.
Okay, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.